You stand at the edge of a canyon in the Peruvian highlands, staring at what looks like a natural rock formation. The wind howls through the gorge, carrying with it the scent of thin mountain air and ancient dust. But then your guide points upward, and suddenly everything shifts. What you thought was a cliff face reveals itself as something else entirely, a massive stone platform jutting from the mountainside, engineered with such precision that modern architects still can't fully explain how it was built. Welcome to Peru's prehistory, where the mountains themselves seem to have been reshaped by hands we can barely comprehend. For decades, archaeologists have walked these slopes, documenting ruins that defy our assumptions about what ancient peoples could accomplish without steel tools, without the wheel, without written blueprints. These aren't the famous sites you learned about in school. These are the mysteries that live in the shadows of Machu Picchu, the engineering marvels that predate the Inca by centuries, the structures so ambitious they make you wonder if we've been telling ourselves the wrong story about human capability all along. Today, we're climbing into the thin air of the Andes to explore 6 astonishing sites where the questions outnumber the answers, where every excavation uncovers more riddles than solutions, where the official explanations feel incomplete the moment you stand in front of the stones themselves. We'll walk through plazas built by cultures whose names were forgotten before the Spanish ever arrived. We'll examine walls that shouldn't exist according to conventional timelines. We'll confront evidence that suggests ancient Peruvians possessed knowledge we're only now beginning to understand. And through it all, we'll ask the question that drives every archaeologist who works in these mountains: how did they do it? And more importantly, why did they push themselves to such extremes? The answers matter because they tell us who we are as a species, what we're capable of when we dream big enough, and what secrets might still be waiting beneath our feet. The terraced platforms of Choqquequirao rise from the jungle-draped slopes like a stone testament to ambition, a sister city to Machu Picchu that most visitors never reach because the journey demands a 16-mile trek through wilderness that seems designed to turn back the unprepared. Built sometime between 1400 and 1500 CE by Inca engineers who chose this impossibly remote location for reasons historians still debate, Choqquequirao sprawls across nearly 4,000 acres of near-vertical mountainside, its agricultural terraces stepping down into the Apurimac River Valley 3,000 feet below. The name means cradle of gold in Quechua, and when you finally reach the site after 2 days of hiking, you understand why early explorers whispered about lost treasure and hidden royal estates. Archaeologists have mapped over 100 structures here, including ceremonial plazas, residential compounds, irrigation channels, and massive stone staircases that connect different elevation zones with engineering precision that seems almost contemptuous of gravity. What makes Choqquequirao particularly baffling is the llama terrace system on the lower slopes, where ancient masons created white stone llamas set into the terraces themselves, visible only from certain vantage points across the valley. These figures weren't decorative afterthoughts. They were integral to the terrace construction, built as the platforms rose from the earth. Excavations beginning in the 1970s revealed that the site was occupied continuously from around 1420 CE until shortly after the Spanish conquest, serving as both an agricultural center and possibly a royal retreat or religious sanctuary. The scale of the agricultural engineering alone staggers modern agronomists. Over 60 terraces follow the mountain's contours, each one supported by precisely fitted stone retaining walls that have held firm for 5 centuries, despite earthquakes that have toppled modern buildings in nearby cities. The soil composition of each terrace varies by elevation, suggesting the inhabitants understood microclimates and grew different crops at different heights. Coca at lower elevations, potatoes higher up, perhaps quinoa at the very top. But here's what keeps researchers awake at night: the logistics. Every stone used in construction had to be quarried, shaped, transported up those brutal slopes, and fitted into place without mortar, without metal tools harder than bronze, without draft animals capable of bearing heavy loads. The nearest major quarry sits 3 miles away, across terrain that modern hikers find exhausting even without carrying anything. Simple mathematics tells us that building Choqquequirao would have required thousands of workers laboring for decades, coordinated by master planners who could envision the finished complex before a single stone was laid. Yet we have no administrative records, no construction logs, no archaeological evidence of the massive workforce camps that should exist if conventional theories are correct. Some researchers argue Choqquequirao was built as a forward defensive position during Inca expansion into the lowlands. Others suggest it was a sacred site connected to mountain worship and the Apurimac River, which the Inca considered one of the holiest rivers in their empire. A third theory proposes that Choqquequirao served as an agricultural laboratory where Inca agronomists experimented with crop varieties and terracing techniques before implementing them elsewhere. Each theory has merit, but none fully explains why anyone would choose such a punishing location when easier sites existed nearby. And then there's the mystery of the empty chambers. Excavations have found dozens of rooms with no clear purpose, no storage jars, no domestic refuse, no evidence of habitation. These spaces were built with the same care as everything else, their walls precisely fitted, their doorways perfectly aligned with astronomical events. What happened in these rooms? What ceremonies or meetings took place in spaces that were then carefully cleaned and abandoned? Local legends speak of giants who built the ancient structures, beings of enormous strength who could lift stones no human could budge. Modern archaeologists dismiss these stories as folklore, but the oral traditions persist, passed down through generations who lived on these mountains long before academics arrived with their measuring tapes and theories. Picture yourself standing on the highest terrace at dawn, watching fog roll up from the valley below, knowing that hundreds of people once lived and worked here in isolation so complete that the rest of the world might as well not have existed. What drove them to this place? What promise was so compelling that families would choose these slopes over the easier valleys? The stones remember, but they're not talking. We still don't know what Choqquequirao meant to the people who built it, what ceremonies filled those empty rooms, or why the llama terraces were positioned to be visible only from across an impassable gorge. The circular sunken plazas of Chavín de Huántar present an even older mystery, pushing our timeline back to between 1500 and 300 BCE, when the Chavín culture dominated the northern highlands and established what many archaeologists consider Peru's first major religious and cultural tradition. Located at 10,330 feet above sea level, where 2 rivers converge in the Mosna River Valley, Chavín de Huántar wasn't just a settlement. It was a pilgrimage destination that drew devotees from across ancient Peru, evidenced by pottery styles and artifacts from coastal and highland regions found in the ceremonial refuse. The site's most famous feature is the Old Temple, a U-shaped structure built around a sunken circular plaza 40 meters in diameter. But what makes Chavín truly inexplicable lies beneath the temple complex, in a labyrinth of underground galleries that seem designed to disorient and overwhelm anyone who entered them. These aren't natural caves expanded for ceremonial use. They're deliberately engineered passages carved through solid rock, their walls lined with precisely fitted stone, their corners sharp and intentional. More than 200 interior galleries snake through the complex, some barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways, others opening into chambers large enough to hold dozens of participants. At the center of this underground maze stands the Lanzon, a 15-foot-tall carved granite monolith depicting a fanged deity with serpents for hair, positioned at the intersection of 4 galleries, in a way that suggests it served as the physical and spiritual axis of the entire complex. Acoustic engineers who've studied Chavín discovered something remarkable. The galleries were designed as resonance chambers. Water flowing through purpose-built channels produced roaring sounds that echoed through the passages. Pututu shell trumpets played in certain galleries created frequencies that would have seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Experiments conducted in the 1990s demonstrated that specific frequencies produced in the temple complex can induce altered states of consciousness, causing disorientation, visual hallucinations, and profound emotional responses. Was this intentional? Did Chavín priests understand acoustic engineering well enough to create immersive sensory experiences that would convince pilgrims they were encountering the divine? Excavations have also uncovered evidence of extensive ritual activity involving psychoactive substances. Ceramic mortars with residue from San Pedro cactus, which contains mescaline, have been found in ceremonial contexts. Depictions of figures holding the cactus appear in stone carvings throughout the complex. The combination of acoustic manipulation, mind-altering substances, and the deliberately confusing underground architecture suggests Chavín's priests orchestrated experiences that would fundamentally alter a pilgrim's perception of reality. But who were these priests? Where did they acquire their knowledge of acoustics, pharmacology, and psychological manipulation? The Chavín culture appears suddenly in the archaeological record, already sophisticated, already commanding regional influence. There's no clear developmental sequence showing earlier experimental phases or simpler prototypes. It's as if the entire complex was conceived and executed by people who already understood exactly what they wanted to achieve. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest construction around 1500 BCE, making Chavín roughly contemporary with the height of ancient Egypt's New Kingdom, yet developing entirely independently on the opposite side of the world. The precision of the underground galleries rivals anything built in the Mediterranean at that time. The astronomical alignments. The temple's axis points toward the rising point of key stars on ritual dates, demonstrate sophisticated observational astronomy. The irrigation and drainage systems built to manage water flow through the site show engineering expertise that wouldn't be matched in the region for another 1,000 years. Now consider this unsettling detail. In 1919, archaeologist Julio Tello excavated a series of stone-lined galleries that contained hundreds of ceramic vessels, each one deliberately smashed. These weren't accidental breakages. Every vessel had been carefully positioned and then systematically destroyed in what appears to have been a massive ritual termination event. What happened at Chavín that required the destruction of so much ceremonial pottery? What shift in belief or power led to the abandonment of a site that had commanded regional devotion for over a millennium? Some researchers point to climate records showing a significant drought around 500 BCE that might have discredited the priests' claims to control natural forces. Others suggest invasion or internal conflict. A few propose that the Chavín tradition simply evolved into new forms that we recognize as later cultures. But none of these explanations account for the scale of the termination ritual or the completeness with which Chavín knowledge seems to have vanished from the archaeological record. The acoustic engineering, the architectural sophistication, the astronomical understanding, these weren't rediscovered by later Peruvian cultures. They seem to have died with Chavín. Local traditions preserved in colonial Spanish records speak of a race of sorcerers who lived in the mountains before the Inca, masters of earth and water who could speak to the stones themselves. The Spanish friars who recorded these stories dismissed them as pagan superstition, but they found the underground galleries threatening enough that they sealed some passages and forbade indigenous people from entering what remained accessible. Imagine descending into those galleries by torchlight, water roaring through hidden channels, shell trumpets bellowing from passages you can't see, the walls seeming to vibrate with sounds that make your chest tighten and your vision blur. Would you have believed you were encountering gods? would you have emerged convinced you'd touched something beyond human understanding? The priests who designed this experience knew exactly what they were doing, but we still don't know where they learned to do it, why they abandoned it, or where their knowledge went when Chavín fell silent. The stone towers of Sillustani rise from a peninsula jutting into Lake Umayo at 12,500 feet above sea level. Their cylindrical forms silhouetted against the massive sky like fingers reaching toward clouds that seem close enough to touch. Built primarily by the Kula people between 1200 and 1450 CE, before and during the early Inca period, these structures served as above-ground burial chambers for nobility, their interiors containing mummified remains placed in fetal positions, along with offerings of gold, silver, ceramics, and textiles. But calling them burial chambers doesn't capture the strangeness of these buildings. The towers, called chulpas in Quechua, stand up to 40 feet tall, their walls constructed from precisely cut blocks of andesite and sandstone that fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The most remarkable feature is their construction technique. The towers are wider at the top than at the base, an inverted taper that defies architectural common sense and creates structural challenges that modern engineers struggle to replicate. How do you build a 40-foot stone tower that grows wider as it rises without having it topple during construction? How do you cut and place massive stones overhead when you're working on a narrow base that can't support extensive scaffolding? The logistics seem impossible, yet 15 major towers still stand at Sillustani, and archaeological surveys have identified remains of dozens more around Lake Umayo's perimeter. The stonework quality varies dramatically between structures. Some towers display masterwork precision, their stones shaped with such accuracy that investigators initially assumed metal tools must have been used, until metallurgical analysis confirmed that the Kula had only copper and bronze implements, far too soft to shape hard andesite with the precision observed. Other towers show rougher construction, their stones barely modified, gaps between blocks filled with smaller stones, and mud mortar. This variation suggests either a long construction period during which techniques evolved, or multiple builders working simultaneously with different skill levels. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found in the towers supports both interpretations, showing construction activity spanning several centuries. What compels archaeologists to return to Sillustani year after year isn't just the towers themselves, but the questions they raise about ancient Andean cosmology and death practices. The Kula mummified their elite dead, positioning them to face east toward the rising sun, and sealed them in chambers accessible only through small openings near the tower tops. But these weren't simple tombs. Evidence suggests the towers remained active ritual sites for generations after the initial burials, with offerings periodically added through the entrance holes. The structures seem to have functioned as permanent shrines where the living could maintain relationships with deceased ancestors who were believed to retain agency and influence over natural forces like rain and crop fertility. This makes sense within Andean cosmology, which didn't draw hard boundaries between living and dead, natural and supernatural, past and present. But it doesn't explain why the Kula invested such enormous resources in building these specific structures. Simpler burial forms existed. Many cultures placed mummified ancestors in caves or specially built rooms within residential compounds. Why construct 40-foot stone towers on a windswept peninsula using architectural techniques so challenging that even the builders sometimes couldn't execute them successfully? Several partially built towers stand abandoned at Sillustani, their stones cut and stacked, but the work never completed. Recent geophysical surveys have revealed an even deeper mystery. The chulpas sit atop earlier structures. Ground-penetrating radar shows stone platforms and possibly earlier burial chambers beneath several towers. Excavations of these lower levels have produced artifacts dating to 800-1000 CE, pushing Sillustani's occupation back several centuries before the towers were built. This suggests the peninsula held sacred significance long before the Kulla began their megalithic construction project. But why? What made this particular spot important enough to justify continuous ritual use across half a millennium? Some researchers argue the location is astrologically significant, noting that certain towers align with solstice sunrise positions, and that Lake Umayo might have served as a ritual landscape where water, mountains, and sky converged in cosmologically meaningful ways. Others point to the lake's ecology. It's home to species found nowhere else, which might have given it special status in local belief systems. A third interpretation suggests Sillustani was a frontier zone between highland and lowland cultures, making it a natural place for elaborate mortuary displays that signaled power and territorial control. Each explanation is plausible, but none feels complete when you're standing beside a 40-foot tower, watching storm clouds roll across the Altiplano, wondering how many years of labor went into cutting those stones, how many workers hauled them up the peninsula, and how many ceremonies accompanied the placement of each block. The colonial Spanish who encountered Sillustani in the 16th century recorded local legends about giants who built the towers before the coming of humans, being strong enough to lift the massive stones into place as easily as humans stack firewood. The Spanish dismissed these stories, but they found the towers unsettling enough that they destroyed the tops of several, creating the truncated ruins visible today. What threatened them about these structures? What did they see in the towers that made destruction seem necessary? Modern visitors sometimes report unusual experiences at Sillustani, sudden temperature drops in specific locations, sounds that seem to come from inside the towers, intense emotional responses when touching certain stones. Skeptics attribute these reports to altitude sickness, suggestion, and the dramatic landscape creating heightened emotional states. But the reports persist across decades and cultures, suggesting something about Sillustani affects people in ways we don't fully understand. The stones are still there, still keeping their secrets, still defying our assumptions about what ancient people could accomplish with supposedly primitive technology. We still don't know why the towers are wider at the top, how the builders managed the structural engineering, why some construction projects were abandoned mid-build, or what ceremonies took place when the mummified nobles were sealed inside their stone chambers to watch over the living from their perches above the lake. The agricultural laboratory of Moray spreads across a natural depression in the Urubamba Valley at 11,500 feet, its concentric terraces descending like an amphitheater carved by beings who understood Earth systems at a level we're only beginning to appreciate. Dating to around 1400–1532 CE, during the height of Inca civilization, Moray consists of three major circular terrace systems, the largest descending nearly 500 feet through 15 concentric levels, each terrace perfectly sculpted to follow the natural bowl shape of the depression. Walk the rim of the main complex, and you're looking down at a stone mandala, a circular pattern so precise it seems computer-designed. Its symmetry hypnotic, its purpose initially baffling to the Spanish conquistadors who encountered it and saw only inexplicable terraces leading nowhere. Modern agronomists examining Moray have proposed that it functioned as an agricultural research station where Inca scientists experimented with crop varieties and growing conditions. Temperature measurements taken at different terrace levels reveal significant microclimates. The bottom terrace can be 27 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the top, creating an environmental gradient that essentially replicates conditions from high mountain valleys down to lower elevations. By planting the same crop at different levels, Inca researchers could observe how varieties performed under different temperature and moisture regimes, effectively running controlled experiments to identify optimal growing conditions and develop crops adapted to specific environments. If this interpretation is correct, and most researchers now accept it as the best available explanation, then Moray represents agricultural science sophisticated enough to rival modern research stations. The implications are staggering. The Inca Empire controlled territory stretching from modern Ecuador to central Chile, encompassing an enormous range of climates and elevations. Being able to predict how crops would perform in different regions before actually planting them across the empire would have been an incredible strategic advantage, allowing agricultural planners to optimize food production and minimize crop failures that could lead to famine and political instability. But accepting Moray as an agricultural laboratory raises as many questions as it answers. Who designed these experiments? What records did they keep? How did they communicate findings across the empire? The Inca had no written language as we understand it, using instead a system of knotted strings called quipu to record numerical and possibly narrative information. If agricultural data from Moray was encoded in quipu, those records are lost. Spanish colonizers destroyed most quipu they encountered, and modern scholars still can't fully decode the examples that survive. Without records, we're left inferring Moray's purpose from the structures themselves and the remarkable temperature gradients they create. The precision of the construction adds another layer of mystery. The terraces aren't simple concentric circles. Each one is slightly elliptical, and the spacing between levels varies in ways that suggest deliberate engineering rather than aesthetic choice. Hydrological studies show that Moray's design includes sophisticated drainage systems that prevented water from pooling at lower levels, where it would have created swamp, conditions unsuitable for most crops. Underground channels carved through bedrock direct runoff away from the terraces, and the soil composition at each level appears to have been carefully modified, mixing clay, sand, and organic matter in proportions that vary by depth. This level of soil engineering implies knowledge that supposedly wasn't codified until modern soil science emerged in the 19th century. How did Inca agronomists know to adjust soil porosity and nutrient content by terrace level? Did they develop this knowledge through centuries of trial and error, or did they inherit it from earlier cultures who left no other trace of such sophisticated understanding? Recent excavations have uncovered evidence that makes Moray even stranger. Beneath the Inca period terraces, archaeologists found remnants of earlier agricultural structures, suggesting the site was in use before the Inca arrived in the region. Pottery fragments and radiocarbon dates push some of this activity back to around 1100 CE, during the period when the Wari culture dominated much of highland Peru. Did the Wari use Moray for agricultural experiments? Did the Inca simply adopt and refine a system they found already in place? If so, where did the Wari learn these techniques? The questions spiral backward through time, each answer revealing earlier mysteries. And then there's the ceremonial aspect that most scientific interpretations downplay or ignore. Moray's geometric perfection suggests more than utilitarian function. The site aligns with key astronomical events. The main terrace system's axis points toward the June solstice sunset. Stone pillars positioned around the rim may have served as sighting markers for tracking solar and stellar movements throughout the year. Local traditions recorded in colonial documents describe Moray as a sacred place where earth and sky married, where the feminine energy of the Pachamama, Mother Earth, combined with masculine solar power to generate fertility and abundance. If Moray served both scientific and ceremonial purposes, if agricultural research and religious ritual were understood as inseparable aspects of the same process, then our modern categories of science and religion might be distorting our understanding of what ancient Andean people were actually doing. Perhaps to them, experimenting with crops and honoring earth deities weren't separate activities, but different facets of a unified practice we can barely conceptualize from our fragmented modern worldview. Stand at the bottom of Moray's deepest terrace complex on a clear night, and you're surrounded by stone walls rising in concentric circles to frame a perfect circle of stars overhead. The geometry makes you feel small but connected, as if you're standing at the navel of some vast living system that extends from the earth beneath your feet to the cosmos wheeling above. Did Inca priests and scientists stand here contemplating the same relationship between immediate soil conditions and eternal celestial patterns? Did they see agriculture as applied astronomy, the practice of aligning human activity with cosmic rhythms? The stones don't answer, but they invite the questions, and that invitation might be the most important thing Moray offers. Not solutions, but the recognition that ancient people thought deeply about their relationship with natural systems and created structures that embodied their understanding. We still don't know how they determined optimal soil mixtures for each terrace level, what records they kept of experimental results, whether they ran multi-year studies tracking crop performance over time, or how widely the knowledge generated at Moray was distributed and implemented across the empire. The fortress complex of Sacsayhuaman looms over Cusco at 12,140 feet. Its massive zigzagging walls built from limestone blocks so large that conventional explanations about how they were moved and positioned strained credibility to the breaking point. Constructed primarily between 1438 and 1471 CE under the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, though some evidence suggests earlier foundations, Sacsayhuaman served as both ceremonial center and military stronghold, its walls extending nearly a third of a mile and rising in 3 tiers with stones weighing up to 200 tons. The largest blocks measure over 20 feet tall and nearly as wide, their surfaces shaped to fit against adjacent stones with joints so tight that investigators famously can't slide a knife blade between them. This precision extends across thousands of stones, each one unique in shape, each one fitted to its neighbors in a 3-dimensional puzzle that seems to require computational abilities the Inca supposedly didn't possess. How do you cut irregular polygonal stones from quarry faces located miles away, transport them across terrain that includes a river valley and steep slopes, and then fit them into predetermined positions within a wall where every stone depends on every other stone being exactly the right shape? Modern engineers using computer modeling and laser-guided cutting tools find the task challenging. How did Inca masons accomplish it with copper and bronze tools, human muscle power, and what we presume was simple rope and lever technology? The standard explanation involves enormous labor forces, decades of work, and techniques like repeatedly wetting and heating stone to create fracture planes that could be exploited with hammerstones. Experiments conducted by archaeologists have shown that such methods can shape stone, though achieving the precision visible at Sacsayhuaman remains difficult even for skilled modern masons replicating ancient techniques. But the labor and patience explanation doesn't address several troubling details. First, the stones show evidence of fine surface finishing that suggests abrasion by harder materials than copper or bronze. Microscopic analysis reveals striations, consistent with tools made from materials harder than the limestone being worked. What did the Inca use for this finishing work? Did they have access to limited quantities of meteoric iron or other hard materials that don't appear elsewhere in the archaeological record? Second, the wall design includes features that seem over-engineered for simple defensive purposes. The zigzag pattern creates salience and re-entrance that military architects recognize as providing excellent fields of fire for defenders, but the scale exceeds anything necessary to repel attackers using the weapons available in pre-Columbian Peru. The massive scale suggests the walls were meant to impress as much as defend, to demonstrate Inca power through sheer monumental presence. Some researchers propose that Sacsayhuaman served primarily as a ceremonial theater, where state rituals involving thousands of participants could be staged within sight of Cusco below, reinforcing the emperor's authority through spectacular displays. Third, the site includes features that have no clear purpose. The throne of the Inca, a series of carved rock outcrops within the complex, shows smooth surfaces and geometric shapes that some investigators initially attributed to natural erosion, until closer examination revealed deliberate human modification. What ceremonies took place on these carved rocks? Why invest labor in shaping outcrops that could have been left natural or simply quarried for building stone? The questions multiply the more closely you examine the site. Spanish chroniclers who witnessed Sacsayhuaman shortly after the conquest recorded indigenous accounts claiming the fortress was built by a much earlier race of giants who could handle the enormous stones with ease. The Spanish found these stories ridiculous, but couldn't offer better explanations for constructions that impressed them despite their general contempt for indigenous culture. One chronicler calculated that finishing Sacsayhuaman must have required 20,000 men working for 60 years, a labor commitment that seemed implausible even for an empire as organized as the Inca. Modern estimates using archaeological evidence of tool marks and construction rates suggest even longer timelines or even larger workforces. Yet the site was completed within 1 or 2 generations, according to Inca oral traditions preserved in colonial documents. How did the Inca marshal and sustain such enormous labor forces? The Amita labor tax system they used to conscript workers from across the empire was sophisticated, but feeding, housing, and organizing tens of thousands of construction workers simultaneously would have been a logistical nightmare that should have left massive archaeological evidence, barracks, food storage facilities, tool workshops. Such evidence exists, but not on the scale the conventional timeline suggests it should. Some researchers propose that Sacsayhuaman's lower walls might be much older than the Inca, possibly built by the preceding Quilchi culture or even earlier inhabitants, with the Inca adding upper tiers and repurposing an existing structure. This would explain both the timeline constraints and the variation in construction quality visible across the site. Some walls display the signature Inca polygonal stonework, while others show different techniques. Stratigraphic excavations support multiple construction phases, but dating them precisely remains difficult because the builders left few organic materials suitable for radiocarbon analysis in direct association with the wall foundations. The site was also extensively damaged during and after the Spanish conquest. The upper tier of walls was largely dismantled, its stones repurposed for colonial buildings in Cusco, leaving modern investigators to reconstruct the original configuration from Spanish descriptions and the fragmentary remains. This destruction was partially military. Sacsayhuaman was the site of fierce fighting during the 1536-37 indigenous uprising against Spanish rule, and partially systematic quarrying that continued for centuries. What we see today represents perhaps half of the original complex, making full interpretation even more challenging. Stand within Sacsayhuaman's remaining walls at sunset, and you can feel why conquistadors called it a fortress. The massive stones project in vulnerability, permanence, power that seems to transcend human scale. But you can also sense something else, a quality harder to name, as if the structure embodies knowledge we've forgotten, capabilities we've lost, understanding of stone and earth, and force that modern engineering has replaced with different methods rather than surpassed. Local traditions speak of earthquake-proof construction techniques that allowed Sacsayhuaman's walls to flex during tremors that destroyed Spanish colonial buildings. Modern seismic engineers studying the site have confirmed that the massive interlocking stones can shift slightly during earthquakes and then settle back into position, a dynamic stability that's extremely difficult to achieve intentionally. Did Inca engineers understand earthquake mechanics well enough to design for seismic resilience? Or did they stumble onto techniques that happened to work? Either answer is remarkable. Intentional design implies sophisticated understanding of earth forces, while accidental success suggests an intuitive grasp of structural principles that we've only recently codified. We still don't know how they moved the 200-ton stones, how they achieved such precise fitting across thousands of unique pieces, why they built on such an overwhelming scale, or what ceremonies filled the complex during its brief decades of full Inca use before Spanish conquest transformed it into a contested symbol of indigenous resistance and colonial power. The geoglyphs of the Palpa Valley sprawl across desert Pampa, just south of the more famous Nazca Lines, their designs ranging from geometric patterns to figurative images including monkeys, birds, orcas, and human-like figures with elaborate headdresses. Created primarily between 400 BCE and 600 CE by the Paracas and Nazca cultures. Though some forms may be older, these ground markings were made by removing the dark desert pavement stones to expose lighter soil underneath, creating lines and shapes that remain visible centuries later because the hyper-arid environment preserves them with minimal erosion. The Palpa geoglyphs include all the forms found at Nazca: lines extending for miles, geometric shapes, animal figures, but they also feature distinctive trapezoid platforms and architectural remains that suggest integration between ground markings and physical structures in ways that complicate theories about their purpose. Flying over Palpa in a small plane, which is how most visitors experience the geoglyphs, you see an alien landscape, a desert covered with thousands of lines and shapes that seem to have no relationship with human scale or needs. From ground level, most geoglyphs are nearly invisible. You can walk across lines without recognizing them as intentional designs. Only from elevated positions, either from nearby hills or from aircraft, do the patterns become coherent, revealing themselves as deliberate constructions rather than natural features. This has led to endless speculation about why ancient people would create designs meant to be seen from vantage points they couldn't easily access. Did they build viewing towers now lost to time? Were the geoglyphs meant for gods or ancestors observing from the sky? Or were they designed to be understood through ritual walking, their full pattern revealed only in the mind of someone who traced every line and corner? The standard academic interpretation, developed primarily by archaeologist Maria Rica over decades of fieldwork, argues that the Nazca Lines and Palpa geoglyphs served astronomical and calendrical functions, with major lines pointing towards significant solar and lunar positions and geometric shapes marking areas where seasonal ceremonies took place. Later research by Johann Reinhard and others proposed that the geoglyphs were ritual pathways connected to water worship and mountain deities, with lines pointing towards sacred peaks and figures representing beings believed to control rain and fertility. Both interpretations find support in the evidence. Many lines do align with solstice positions and celestial events important in Andean cosmology. Ceramic offerings and small platforms found at line intersections suggest ceremonial activity. The design's massive scale would have required communal labor, potentially serving to bind communities together through shared ritual projects. But neither interpretation fully explains the variety of forms or the fact that different geoglyph types often overlap, with later designs crossing earlier ones, as if the ground served as a constantly reworked ritual canvas rather than a permanent, fixed monument. Recent high-resolution photogrammetry and ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed features invisible from the air, including thousands of small cairns and artifact deposits associated with specific geoglyph sections. These discoveries suggest the ground surface was ritually active in ways that go beyond simply making and viewing large designs. People walked the lines repeatedly, leaving offerings at specific points, treating the geoglyphs as pilgrimage routes or ceremonial pathways that connected natural features like springs and mountain peaks with constructed centers like the ceremonial site of Cahuachi, 14 miles to the south. This interpretation frames the geoglyphs as infrastructure for religious practice, rather than representations of religious beliefs. Not pictures of gods, but roads to the divine. What makes Palpa particularly puzzling is the presence of figurative geoglyphs showing clear influence from cultures hundreds of miles away. The orca images, for instance, depict a marine animal that lives in Pacific waters visible from Peru's coast, but not present in the desert interior. The monkeys resemble species native to the Amazon rainforest over the Andes to the east, nowhere near Palpa. These foreign elements suggest the Nazca and Paracas people maintained long-distance contact with coastal and jungle regions, trading goods and possibly ideas that became incorporated into their desert ritual landscape. But how regular was this contact? What drew people from such diverse environments into religious or cultural exchange? The conventional image of pre-Columbian Peru as a collection of isolated regional cultures interacting only through occasional contact and conflict doesn't fit the evidence from Palpa, which implies much more extensive and sustained interaction across ecological zones. Excavations at associated sites have uncovered even stranger details. At Palpa's ceremonial centers, archaeologists found evidence of intentional building destruction, followed by careful burial of the ruins beneath new construction. Buildings were systematically dismantled, their materials often broken or burned, and then the entire site was covered with clean fill before new structures rose on top. This pattern repeats across multiple construction episodes, suggesting a ritual cycle of building, using, destroying, and rebuilding that spanned centuries. What beliefs drove this destructive cycle? Were buildings thought to accumulate spiritual pollution that required periodic cleansing through destruction? Did political changes demand architectural renewal as new rulers legitimated their authority by literally burying the past? The evidence doesn't provide clear answers, leaving us with the archaeological record of deliberate destruction without definitive explanations for why ancient Andean peoples would invest enormous labor in creating structures only to destroy and replace them. And there's the matter of the unfinished geoglyphs. Several major figures at Palpa show clear evidence of being abandoned mid-construction, their outlines partially cleared but never completed. Why? What circumstances interrupted projects that must have involved dozens of workers over weeks or months? Did the culture that created them collapse before finishing their work? Did religious beliefs shift, rendering certain designs inappropriate or obsolete? Or did ancient geoglyph makers simply decide some designs weren't working and start over with different patterns, the way a modern artist might discard an unsuccessful sketch? Without written records explaining their choices, we're left interpreting silences and absences. Local traditions recorded by Spanish chroniclers spoke of ancient lines that marked the paths of the first humans to emerge from the earth, routes walked by ancestors who established the sacred geography of the world. The Spanish found these stories fascinating but ultimately incomprehensible, filing them away as pagan mythology rather than trying to understand the cosmology they represented. Modern researchers reading those colonial documents recognize that we might have lost crucial contextual information that would make the geoglyphs comprehensible in ways that remain just out of reach. Picture yourself standing on one of Palpa's elevated platforms at dawn, watching the first light reveal lines radiating across the desert floor, stretching toward distant mountains that channel rain from the sky to the earth. Imagine understanding this landscape as animated by forces that could be influenced through ritual action, through the creation of massive designs that demonstrated devotion, power, and willingness to invest communal labor in sacred projects. The geoglyphs might have been prayers written in stone and soil, requests for water and fertility spelled out in forms large enough to be read by beings dwelling in mountains and sky. Or they might have been something we can't even properly conceptualize, because our culture has severed connections between landscape, cosmology, and community that ancient Andean peoples took as fundamental truths about reality. We still don't know why they created designs visible only from heights they couldn't access, why they overlaid new geoglyphs on older ones without apparent concern for preservation, why some figures reference distant animals while others depict local creatures, or what walking those lines meant to the people who made them and the generations who returned to trace their paths across the desert that remembers everything. These mysteries matter because they remind us that human capability extends far beyond what we give our ancestors credit for. When we stand before structures like Sacsayhuaman's 200-ton stones, or walk the terraces of Moray's agricultural laboratory, we're not just looking at ruins. We're confronting evidence that ancient peoples possessed knowledge and skills we can barely replicate with modern technology. The precision stonework, the acoustic engineering, the agricultural science, the landscape art on a scale that staggers imagination, these accomplishments weren't flukes or accidents. They represent systematic inquiry, intergenerational knowledge transmission, and communal commitment to projects whose benefits might not be realized for decades or centuries. What drives a culture to undertake such works? What shared vision convinces thousands of people to spend their lives moving stones, carving channels, clearing desert lines, when the immediate benefits seem abstract and the labor costs are crushing? The answer tells us something fundamental about human nature. We're a species that thinks in generations, that builds for futures we won't see, that creates monuments not because they're necessary for survival, but because they express who we are and what we believe about our place in the cosmos. The questions these sites raise are as important as any answers we might develop. When we ask how Inca masons achieved joints so precise that knife blades won't fit between stones, we're really asking what we've lost in our rush toward modern methods. When we wonder why Chavin's priests understood acoustic manipulation well enough to induce altered consciousness through architectural design, we're confronting the possibility that ancient peoples explored domains of knowledge we've ignored or forgotten. When we puzzle over why anyone would build 40-foot burial towers using inverted taper construction that challenges modern engineering, we're admitting that our assumptions about linear technological progress might be incomplete or wrong. Every culture makes choices about what knowledge to pursue and preserve. We've chosen certain paths: industrial efficiency, digital technology, global communication, and those choices have brought genuine benefits. But they've also meant abandoning other paths, other ways of relating to materials and landscapes and community. Ancient Andean peoples chose different paths. They developed knowledge about stone and earth that we're still trying to reverse engineer. They created ritual systems that bound communities across generations. They built monuments that have outlasted empires, weathered earthquakes that destroyed modern buildings, and continue inspiring wonder in everyone who encounters them. The mysteries endure because the people who created these sites didn't leave instruction manuals or detailed records explaining their methods and motivations. What we have are the structures themselves and the fragmentary evidence archaeologists painstakingly recover and interpret. Every excavation uncovers new data, but new data often means new questions. Finding evidence of acoustic engineering at Chavín doesn't solve the mystery, it deepens it by revealing sophistication we didn't know we needed to explain. Discovering that Moray's terraces create precise temperature gradients doesn't end the inquiry. It raises questions about how ancient agronomists knew to design such systems and what other knowledge they possessed that left no archaeological trace. The circular nature of archaeological investigation means we're always chasing receding horizons. Each answer opens new questions. Each solved puzzle reveals more intricate patterns requiring explanation. This isn't a failure of archaeology as a discipline. It's the nature of investigating cultures separated from us by centuries. Cultures that operated with different assumptions and priorities. Cultures whose most fundamental beliefs about reality may have been so different from ours that we literally lack the conceptual vocabulary to describe them accurately. But that difficulty, that permanent gap between ancient intentions and modern interpretations, isn't cause for despair. It's an invitation to humility and wonder. The fact that we can't fully explain Sacsayhuaman's construction methods or definitively decode Palpa's geoglyphs means we're encountering genuine mystery, not the fake mystery of manufactured controversy, but the real mystery of human capability and cultural diversity. These sites prove that there have always been multiple ways of being human, multiple paths toward knowledge and meaning, multiple solutions to the challenges of survival and expression. Our inability to fully understand what our ancestors accomplished doesn't diminish them. It challenges us to think more creatively, question our assumptions more rigorously, and recognize that the human story is richer and stranger than we typically imagine. The myths and legends surrounding these sites, the giants who lifted stones, the sorcerers who spoke to mountains, the ancient voyagers from across oceans, aren't just colorful folklore to be dismissed by serious researchers. They're evidence of how communities tried to make sense of accomplishments that impressed even the people who lived among the ruins. When local traditions speak of superhuman builders, they're acknowledging that these structures represent capabilities that seem to transcend normal human limits. Modern archaeology provides more mundane explanations involving labor organization and engineering techniques. But those explanations don't invalidate the sense of wonder that leads people to invoke giants and sorcerers. Both responses, the mythic and the scientific, emerge from the same recognition that we're dealing with something extraordinary, achievements that demand explanation and inspire awe. So what should we take from these mysteries? Not conclusions, but perspectives, an appreciation for human ingenuity across cultures and centuries, recognition that technological progress isn't the only measure of cultural sophistication, respect for knowledge systems different from our own, humility about the limits of what we can know from fragmentary evidence, and perhaps most importantly, inspiration to keep asking questions, to keep digging both literally and metaphorically, because the ground beneath our feet and the ruins scattered across it contain stories we haven't heard yet, solutions to problems we haven't thought to ask, and evidence of human capability that continues surprising us, no matter how much we think we know. Every stone at Choqquequirao, every gallery at Chavín, every tower at Sillustani, every terrace at Moray, every wall at Sacsayhuaman, every line at Palpa, they're all invitations. Invitations to wonder, to question, to imagine standing in the place of the people who built them and trying to see the world through their eyes. What did it feel like to be part of a community that could organize thousands of workers to move 200-ton stones? What did it mean to descend into acoustic chambers designed to alter your consciousness and make you believe you'd encountered the divine? What prayers accompanied the clearing of each line across Palpa's desert floor? What ceremonies marked the completion of Sillustani's towers and the sealing of nobles inside their stone chambers? We can't answer these questions with certainty, but asking them brings us closer to the people who lived these experiences, reminds us that they were as fully human as we are, as capable of wonder and achievement, as worthy of being remembered. The work continues. New excavations are underway at sites throughout Peru. New technologies, LiDAR, ground-penetrating radar, advanced dating techniques, reveal features invisible to earlier investigators. New theoretical frameworks help researchers ask better questions and interpret evidence in more sophisticated ways. The mysteries won't be solved in any final sense, but our understanding deepens year by year, generation by generation, as we slowly piece together the human story these sites tell. And that's fitting, because these monuments were built across generations by people who understood that some work transcends individual lifetimes. Some projects require sustained commitment across decades. Some meanings only emerge when we're willing to invest everything in creating something that will outlast us. Keep digging, intellectually, spiritually, literally. Keep asking questions. Keep challenging assumptions. Keep looking at ancient stones and refusing to accept simple answers when the evidence whispers complexity. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, waiting for someone curious enough to brush away the soil, patient enough to piece together fragments, humble enough to admit that the people who came before us might have known things we've forgotten. The mountains remember, the stones endure, and the mysteries they hold are gifts we're still unwrapping, revelations that emerge slowly to anyone willing to stand in the thin mountain air and ask what human beings are truly capable of when they dream large enough to carve their visions into the living rock.